everybody, welcome to my live today. I'm at work, but it's a little slow, so if I start saying hola, I'm just talking to some people walking by. I get asked this all the time in the work that I do. I do a lot of trauma release, and people always ask me, how do you release it? And I say, well, we're going to do some muscle testing, and then I'll ask your body what's there, what caused it, how long it's been there, and then we release it, we tap it out. And a lot of people think that just because they see me for 45 minutes or an hour, they're going to have this miraculous permanent change. I mean, they definitely get a change at the moment. Hi, Giselle. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the releasing trauma and what steps are needed afterwards to make sure that we can release the energy, keep it away. So the stuff with trauma is that it usually happens when we are not even capable of thinking about it, right? Somewhere around 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It can also happen when we're in the womb. So a lot of times we carry our parents' trauma. If there's a lot of fighting or something, or just a lot of resonance, a lot of frequencies that are happening in the home, that can also create trauma, because as a child we don't really have the bandwidth. I don't know if you guys know this, but our brain doesn't even really have beta brainwaves, which is part of the rational and reasoning and comprehending, till we're 7. So when we're really young, we can have an environment that may feel not comfortable, but we're not really in the mindset to go, oh, mom's just having a bad day, or mommy and daddy are fighting again, or whatever. So a lot of that stuff contributes to trauma. Trauma doesn't have to be a specific traumatizing incident. There's just this energy that gets stored in the body through lower frequency situations that usually happen to us when we're a child. So when I do these trauma release sessions with my clients, they always ask now what? And I'm like, well, what are you gonna do, right? Because when I was a personal trainer, people would come to me for an hour or 2 a week and they'd be like, why aren't I losing weight? And I'm like, well, what are you eating? I'm not with you. You have to self-regulate and self-monitor. So the same thing is with trauma. We need to self-monitor our thoughts, because what happens is we run off of subconscious programming a lot. And what that means is these stuck energies, these stored energies will fire a signal to our brain hey, where's your anger? Hey, where's your resentment? Or hey, and then we're like, yeah, that. Or we'll just attract situations that will appease that frequency, right? So that's basically what trauma does long term, is it keeps attracting situations to fulfill that reality. Because when we're younger, it's just our reality. As we get older, we know what's right, what's wrong, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, but we don't realize that it actually takes self-regulation and self-monitoring to rid it for good. Joe Dispenza talks a lot about reprogramming the brain. It's very similar. I also talk about brain patterning and brain mapping in my book. It's all tied in. So one thing that I want to share about the self-regulation and self-monitoring, and a few people have told me some things that I found were very helpful as well. So after we release the trauma, basically what happens is that stored energy that is stored in an organ. Each organ is associated with a feeling, and each organ is also associated with a vertebrae. So that's how I personally use the method to tap it out of the vertebrae. And then there's a shift of energy that happens inside the body. The trauma is released from that part of the organ, and you'll feel a shift of energy, and then I muscle test the client to ask if it's gone. If it's not gone, we have to dig deeper. If it is gone, then basically what that means, it doesn't mean that it's gone from your memory, I'll never think about it again. Well, what it means is that when you do think about it, or if you do think about it, you're not going to have like a really gut-wrenching reaction of like, oh, I can't deal with that right now. And it's not going to get stored in that place because we've released it. But what I want to really stress upon is the self-monitoring and self-regulation and what that actually means. So self-monitoring means, what are you thinking about? Right? What thoughts are you allowing into your mind and in your environment that are associated with that type of trauma that you had when you were a child? Like, I'm just going to use an example as like, you know, abandonment, father abandonment or something, or dad leaving or not being around. Well, women will generally draw men into their lives that they'll either create a situation where there's going to be abandonment, or they attract someone who's never really fully been there for them because of the frequency of the signals that they're putting out. So the really important thing about frequencies and what we put out in our mind is that we have to self-regulate. So first thing, self-monitor, right? Self-monitor. What am I thinking? Self-regulate is, how do I regulate this thought into something that's going to be supportive of me? So for instance, if we're like, oh, not, you know, you might have like a trigger, like, oh, not that again, right? So again, trigger happens, we're satisfying the frequency, life experiences are going to continue to keep drawing those things to the frequency so that they keep happening over and over and over again. So the only way to really, really rid trauma for good and the patterns is to shift consciousness, shift the energy. That takes consciousness, that takes effort, it takes monitoring and regulation. I use those terms a lot. So for instance, if you're like, oh, not that again, right? One thing you can do is, I found a little bit harder, is to turn the negative into a positive, right? Like, oh, not that again. Like, oh no, that's wonderful, right? Well, you might not really believe that, so it's really hard to maybe change the negative into a positive if it's like forced. So one thing that a friend of mine told me that a monk had told him is that when you have these thoughts, any negative thought, any trigger, immediately stop yourself and replace it with either or all, I love myself, I forgive myself, or I accept myself. Because everything that we don't like about someone or something else is actually a part of us that we don't like. Even though we may not act like that or behave like that anymore, it's still a part of us, because we wouldn't be able to recognize it if we weren't it in the first place at any point in our life. So a lot of times when we have those thoughts about other things or other people, it's really something we don't like about ourselves. So if you just immediately say, I love myself, I forgive myself, I accept myself, then a couple things happen. One, you're not feeding that lower negative emotion, right? So if we don't feed it, someone told me the other day that feelings are like friends that you have for dinner. If you feed them, they're going to stay. If you don't feed them, they'll go home, right? So it's the same thing. So if we don't feed those thoughts with the persistence of the feeling, right? As soon as the thought comes, then we're like, ooh, we have the feeling. Well, that feeds it. So when the thought comes, the best thing to do is to stop yourself, switch the frequency of the thought to something positive, like I love myself, and then the body's gonna be like, yay, that feels so much better, right? And then the little triggers that are hidden, stored somewhere in your body are gonna be like, hey, that's not what I wanted. And they're gonna go away because they're gonna realize that you're not feeding them anymore. So if you don't feed them anymore, they go away. So it's actually a very simple concept, but it's not a simple process, because it really takes a lot of strength and courage to take care of ourselves. You know, we get so caught up, we allow other people and other situations to define us. So the best thing to do is to just come back to self, come back to loving and appreciating and accepting yourself, because when you do that, nothing else really matters, right? Because if you're happy, it doesn't matter who sucks, because there's sucky people all over the place, all the time. Not to say they suck, but they do sucky things because they're also going through their own pain. So just know that whenever somebody's not behaving in a way that is resonating with you in a positive light, it's not personal. It's their path and their light that they have to find. So I encourage you to find your light and your path that you need to find, so that these things don't create any more harm in your field. So in your energy field. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, because I get asked all the time about, will trauma go away after we release it? Well, I don't know. That's up to you. That's like saying, will my weight stay off after I lose it? I don't know. What are you going to go back to eating? Are you going to just continue to do nothing after you get results, right? It's the same thing. We have to do it every day and mindfully. It takes mindfulness, and it takes consistency, and it takes just a lot of love for self. So if you want to release some trauma in your life, you don't need to see somebody to help tap it out or to help locate it, right? You can do it yourself by stop feeding those negative thoughts and frequencies that are going to keep haunting you and going to keep triggering you and going to keep that trauma stored. So we all have the power to release trauma. The power is in the mind. Okay, the mind creates these situations in the very first place, so the mind can erase them. Okay, so that's my tip for today on releasing trauma: is self-regulation, self-monitoring, and then self-love. Right? Self-love, self-care—they all go together. So immediately stop yourself when you have these negative or any negative thought, like, oh shit, I gotta go to work again today, or oh man, I don't like that restaurant. Like any negative thought is gonna trigger a negative response in your body. So if you find yourself in like a negative Nancy downward spiral, just stop. Just stop and say, I love myself. And then you'll smile, and your body will smile, and you'll feel good, and then those bad things will go somewhere else, where somebody else is resonating off that lower frequency, and they can go feed off of them. So I love myself, I accept myself, I forgive myself. Those are the 3 key phrases for repatterning and ridding those frequencies that don't serve us. So I hope that was helpful for you guys today. I'm going to be doing some more lives now that I finally have access to some decent internet. Yeah, hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. And I love you because you're a reflection of me. So I love myself and I love you. Thank you, and happy April. It's my birthday month. Woo, 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 woo.